All right, so before the whole lunch break thing, we went through a nice simple structure for doing some hypnotherapeutic work, right? And would it be fair to say that you started to experience something significant and shifts are occurring? I realize that not all of you necessarily had a resolution, but all of you got closer to one, if not actually received that. Would that be fair to say? And remember, you're only working for half an hour, and I'm still recommending you initially start with 90 or 120-minute sessions to really be able to put everything in, including the kitchen sink, right? It's an English expression. I don't know why they want kitchen sinks, but apparently we do. So what I want you to know is take this sort of training wheel model we've played with and give you a more general model of what I would consider to be a model for Ericksonian hypnotherapy. Nothing in this list will surprise you except for one or two things that we'll cover tomorrow. But I want you to be aware of it, because then we can start looking at really the therapeutic stage in it to play with that. Before you actually go into this model here, let me just simplify this into 3 steps, just because it puts everything in perspective, right? So this is going to put everything else you do into perspective, and then we can fit under that thing. There's 3 key phases that I personally conceive of in the Ericksonian therapeutic thing. And the reason I give them as phases, not as steps, is because they're not linear. They are all 3 constantly happening, and they're all running inside of each other. So you'll start one, which kind of bleeds into the other one, which goes into another one, and goes back to the first, ends up in the third, comes back to the second. So they just jump all around the place. But there are 3 key things that are constantly happening. Okay? The first one, I call them the 3 T's. I might even put it to 3 T's, just to tease you a bit. The first of the 3 T's is trance induction, if I can actually spell, right? So trance induction is basically everything that gets the conscious processes out of the way, right? And I hope you realize by now, you are constantly doing things to get the conscious process out of the way, and consciousness will resurface and diminish in waves throughout your whole session, right? Which means you're constantly re-inducing trances, technically known as deepening, but really it becomes the same effect. The point of what you're trying to do is to keep limiting the amount of interference you get from the rigidity of the conscious mind. Would that be fair? Do you understand what I mean by that? Yes? The next one, I think a lot of you already understand, is trance training, right? Trance training, as you well know, is accessing as many unconscious potentials as you can, usually in the form of phenomena, because when you access a phenomenon, it proves that trance is working, which goes right back into trance induction. It sidelines the consciousness even more, because once it receives its proof, it creates a stronger dissociation from the unconscious. That conscious unconscious dissociation is going on. The third thing that's happening you're going to start doing a therapy. You're using therapeutic trances. You're using the experiences, you're using the fact that the conscious mind is not so involved from step 1, and the fact that you have lots of experiences brought up in phase 2 to do something practical with it. Each of these 3 phases, and remember, they're not linear, they'll happen constantly throughout a session. Each of these 3 phases has its own unique problems and its own unique solutions. By far, the most difficult of them all is step number 3. And this is usually, ironically, the one that most hypnosis schools, coaching schools, and so on just give you a glib technique for. And it has its uses, but really, I think it misses the point in terms of how important and how significant that particular chunk is. You could probably spend 3 lifetimes just exploring that element and getting some real good material out. Ironically, in our field, hypnosis, most people are fixated on the first step, trance induction, which is actually the simplest of them all. Although, as you saw earlier when we talked about Jakob's resistance, if you like, although I don't think it's really resistance, it was just teaching us how to work, that you can get stuck in ways with that too, right? And then trance training, I've noticed that many hypnotherapists, many hypnotists in general, but hypnotherapists in particular, are petrified of that in case it fails. And I think, whilst we don't necessarily want to laugh at their misfortune, you can see those concerns be much more laughable now, given your experiences, right? So these are the 3 key phases that are constantly running. If you think of like 3 little machines running inside the whole hypnotherapy practice, that's these 3 here. So how does that look in actual practice? Well, let's start with some kind of a problem and outcome dynamic. What is the problem? You can get very elaborate. I've seen models where you spend an hour talking about their family, their history, when and where does it happen, how do you feel, when doesn't it happen, how could it possibly not happen? I mean, it just gets very involved. Personally, I don't get very much up front. I just look at, do I understand what the nature of the problem is? Do I understand kind of what they want? Do I have a sense of where the blockages are? And that's really usually enough for me. Erickson did even less. He just said, what's the problem? Now shut your eyes, and off he went, right? Step number 2 is not a part of my marriage counseling practice. It's actually a term that comes from another hypnotist called Dave Dobson, who's an excellent, phenomenal, like another genius like Milton Erickson, also sadly passed away now. But we'll deal with that more tomorrow, so I'm just putting it in here so you have a complete model. Somewhere in that whole process, you'll be making your decision around inherent skills the person already has, what is the hidden ability and the problem, right? And also what might they be missing? What is it that if they had it, it would be easy to resolve the problem, right? Again, not rocket science at this point. Then number 4, go straight into the whole trance. So steps 1 to 3 are just are relatively invisible because you're doing it in conversation ahead of time. It seems like you're doing chit-chat with the client. This is where the action begins as far as they're concerned. Now, you can start that formally and say, look and focus on this point, and now go inside. You can also do it informally, for example, in the form of an hypnotic lecture, right? Erickson loved doing these sort of things, where he'd say, okay, so your problem is X and Y and Z, and you've tried this and this and this to resolve, and it's failed. Now you've come to me for help. And you really need to understand the human functioning, or the functioning of the human body in this regard. You can breathe, and you can feel comfortable about breathing. Some people have discomfort, but soon it turns into a comfort when they understand the mechanism of breathing, and off he goes, right? The person has no idea that the trance has begun. They're just going like, what's going on, right? So the trance induction, or the trance phase here, I hope you realize, is you can be semi-covert, you can be totally overt. Doesn't matter too much, depends on where you're at with that particular client, okay? Then you have, I pull out 3 phases of trance training purely because, and again, they'll all kind of come together anyways, just to keep you posted with the general idea that you want to be doing a fair number of Dr. Unconsciouses within the process. In other words, you want to talk to a semblance of that conscious mind from time to time. As you get more experience, you'll end up talking to their unconscious more as a somnambulist, although initially you'll think you're talking to a conscious mind until you realize you're not. But this 5, 6, and 7 really is to put you on alert that there are many ways you can run those particular processes, that you do want to make several trips into the fractionation process, that you do have separate tasks to perform in there. There are several different skills that you wish to elicit from them, and that all of them are important to the therapeutic process. And from time to time, you may skip one of those steps. You may not go with a missing skill. It may be enough with an inherent one. Or you may just do a general trance training and discover sufficient resources to do the work you wish to do, in which case you make a professional decision not to continue to find more resources because you can get on with the therapy. And if you're correct, then you did a good job. And if you're incorrect, the client has no idea that when you go back to doing some more trance training, that it wasn't your plan all along. So again, steps 4, 5, 6, and 7 should be pretty straightforward for you because you've been doing it quite a bit now, right? You okay with that one? So let's have a look at the second portion. So really, you can see the general sort of steps 1 to 4, kind of the trance induction phase. You've got to figure out what the heck to do with these people and what kind of people you have. Steps 5, 6, and 7 are really the trance training phase. And then, as we talked about before, I've given to you in a linear list, but these things are happening in cycles continuously anyways. And then 8 through, well, to the end really, is the therapeutic stage. And again, you can do a lot of this stuff as things are happening. For example, when a trance phenomenon comes up, you can start seeding their learning straight away, right? You don't have to wait until a later phase. although you can wait till a later phase. I mean, there's a lot of choices that you have available to you, right? So you know about seeding their learnings, you understand about seeding their future memory, which basically gives the unconscious mind the opportunity to adjust the conscious goal in accordance with the whole personality. And there's many ways you can do that. These are relatively indirect. You can directly ask the unconscious mind to adjust the goal so that it becomes more relevant to the person. There's many things you can do with that. Stage 10 is purposely ambiguous. That's where you do the therapy. So far, you've got a couple of maneuvers you can do in therapy. You've learned the reframe, right? Yes? You've learned to use trance phenomena as power loops in terms of, here's an experience of trance, here's a way of separating yourself from memories and learning something from them. So you can use it as a general, just review your memories in a new way. You learn how to play with the emotions to some degree. So you have 3 simple maneuvers that you can put into that, right? Those of you who've got more coaching and therapy experience can plug whatever model you happen to know into this point as well, and it's much more likely to be successful because the problems you typically run into are less likely to emerge now, right? And we'll come up with some more processes today and of course tomorrow. Integration and testing, well, that's pretty straightforward at this point, right? One thing I may add to this, just to get an idea of completion, this can include what's called the post-hypnotic suggestion phase. What a post-hypnotic suggestion is basically an instruction to experience something outside in the real world once they finish the trance, right? Really, it's the same sort of thing as the future memory, right? And I'll do it this way because it'll be fun. And this was one of Erickson's favorite ways of preparing that. And you should know a lot of these ideas, especially the idea of inherent skill and the idea of the post-hypnotic suggestion, comes from one of my mentors, John Oberdorf, who also did an Ericksonian seminar, an excellent seminar called Training Trances. There's a book of the first portion of that seminar available, and it's a great read. It's really worth reading that. So, you'll recognize, if you do read that book, you'll recognize where some of my ideas came from, and just taking my hats off to him because, of course, that's where I got the start of this. The model I run is a little different from his, not to say that's any necessarily better or worse. It's just the way I perceive it, and hopefully it'll help you perceive it in similar ways. And it's definitely worth getting a second opinion. If you ever watch any of the Erickson videos, especially those commentaries, there's some with Jeffrey Zeig, talking about what Erickson's doing as he's doing therapy. He has a very different model. If you look at his model, you'll notice that it fits into this in some ways, but it's very different. It's much more, if you do ever watch those tapes, you'll enjoy it because it's much more conscious mind oriented. And you go, oh, that makes really a lot of sense. How do you do that? I don't know, but it makes a lot of sense. Whereas hopefully this is like, I don't quite understand this, but yeah, I can do it. It's easy, but I don't quite understand it. That's kind of my preference. But this should be kind of straightforward at this point, right? So the post-hypnotic suggestion, a simple way of doing that is to say, I don't know, how you'll know you've changed. Perhaps you'll go home tonight and something wonderful happens. Perhaps you'll wake up in the morning and this happens. There's been many situations that had they happened in the past, you would have had the old problem resolved. But now when they happen, something different has happened, doesn't it? Just think about it now. So you're basically getting them to re-experience that outside. And if you know some of the contextual situations they'll be in, maybe if it's a car, if it's being at school, being at work, being with certain people, having certain tonality and so on, you basically list them and remind them that in trance, that when they have these experiences, it's a reminder that all this good work that they've done is being solidified. Make sense? This is a relatively straightforward process. After that, we typically want to present amnesia. You can give it more hardline to say, you will forget stuff. My preference is to offer the unconscious mind the opportunity and the right to let the conscious mind forget those portions that are important for it to not interfere with or think about. And so typically you'll have, or at least what I get, is a dual result. The most elegant version was, I think, believe it was yourself, when the gentleman came up who said, I heard everything you said. I have no idea what it was, but I heard everything you said, right? That's a great example of amnesia. He didn't forget the fact he was in trance. He didn't forget the fact that he's had conscious activity whilst in trance. He has no idea what it was, so he can't interfere with it, but at the same time he can acknowledge the fact that it occurred, right? And sometimes, that's a relatively common thing. Sometimes they'll swear that certain portions never occurred. Of course, you don't remind them about that. And other times they'll say they know everything. And if you want to test them on it, just ask them about it. What I recommend you do, if you're going to ask them about what happened in the trance experience, get them to take a break first. Right? Let them walk around for a bit. You know, you'll see people often in a trance afterglow, like where they're doing this sort of thing. Wait till that's stopped, because they're still hovering. There's an afterglow. When hypnosis finishes, especially when a lot of stuff has happened, there tends to be this afterglow that lingers, kind of like when you wake up in the morning, you have this sort of sleep afterglow that lingers. Wait for that to diminish, because they're still on the threshold of trance, so they'll have more access to what's going on there. It's called state-dependent learning. Once they've changed their state more significantly, they're more in their everyday alertness. When you ask them about it then, they've had a much better chance to forget the important bits, which is great, right? And you, of course, understand why now, right? If you do ask about it, don't remind them, say, hey, what do you think about this bit, right? Because then you're reminding them about it again. It's just, is there anything you want to say? How was that experience for you? Is there anything that you recall from that? Versus, what's everything you recall about that? You understand that there's a subtle difference in the way I present it, which will be received differently, right? Self-appreciation, very important. I think it's a fundamental thing. It really comes across clearly reading Erickson, that he really appreciated and respected people of all walks, no matter how messed up their life has become. I mean, some people who came into him really did some messed up things and really experienced some strange and unpleasant situations. And he still respected them immensely. He still treated them as a valuable, unique human being, whether they were prince or pauper, right? And he made a point to ensure that they did the same for themselves, that they appreciate themselves also. So that's an important thing. And then finally, you end the trance. You can do it indirectly, where you say you can come back anytime you feel right. You can do it directly. Erickson was not shy of saying, now count from 20 to 1 and awaken at the count of 1. Right, that's very classic authoritarian hypnosis. Many Ericksonians miss that, which is funny. But you use your instincts, whether you want to make it a more formal ending or informal ending. I like the informal ending because then people go like, what the heck? And I also like that the last part of their trance is a doctor unconscious, because they don't know when they've woken. They don't know why they've just awoken, right? But you don't have to do it that way. You can do it anyway. And there are times when I'll just count them out purely because I consider it to be more valuable for them in that sense. Lastly, you want to distract them from what just occurred because of that trance after we just talked about. Have a general chat, about the weather and all the rest of it. One thing Erickson loved to do is, right up here, before he starts talking about the problem, or maybe around the gold digging stage, he'll start talking about something random. Sometimes actually even before the trance induction, right? Weather, football, a play him and his wife saw, a meal he just had. And people go, huh? He'll make no attempt to segue into it smoothly. He'll just start talking about it. Then he'll interrupt that as though, halfway through, start doing the whole trance induction, the whole process, and by then they're just off in Fairyland. And when they come back and it distracts them, he'll just carry on the conversation from where he left off. And that creates a very nice loop. And this works on a principle in psychology and memory research called recency and primacy. The things you remember the best is the beginning and endings of things, right? So it gives you the beginning of something and the ending of something that fit perfectly together. So the mind has a tendency, it's not a guarantee, but a tendency to put them together as a whole unit, and everything else that's happened in between kind of just vanishes, right? The other version is distraction. Have you ever noticed that, if you have something really important to say to someone, and they go, sure, you tell me your needs in a minute, but first, and they say something completely whatever, and it takes your train of thoughts off, and they go, what is it you want to tell me? And you go, oh, never mind. Because they change your train of thought. I actually used to love to do this, especially with the colleagues that really were going to give them a hard time or going to chew them out of something and so on. You just distract them just to the point where we're about to launch in, and then go afterwards and, so, and what does it want you to say? And they'll go, oh, never mind, and walk off. So the whole model of Ericksonian therapy should be pretty straightforward to you right now, although I appreciate there's many steps in it. It's not so much that you have to remember the steps and the sequence. These are all stuff that's happening pretty much at the same time, layering over each other and so on. And this is one of the reasons why it can feel like or seem like a daunting task, trying to make sense of what Erickson is doing. He's doing basically most of these steps, especially step 4 through 11, are constantly happening on top of each other, and you'll distract in one way and you'll go another way and another way. And so a lot of things are happening, and to keep track of which one's happening for what reason, what stage is at, that can take a little bit of skill sometimes, especially when you're like going there with them, right? Do you have any questions about this?